Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lucy, and this is the first in a series of one reviews I'll be doing on the music of Kyle John Kenowski, namely Need Disease, the album he released in 2020. Mr. Kenowski is a man who needs an introduction, being a relatively underground musician after all. Mr. Kenowski is a Milwaukee based musician and animator, blending a gorgeous acoustic foundation with euphoric overdubbing and production to create something that I find truly unique. Mr. Kenowski's Need Disease opens with Peter, and right out of the gate it's clear that Kenowski isn't fucking aroundski. The production throws everything at the wall to create the best possible foot forward. Vocals coming and going while the acoustic guitar carries us through, and percussion, synthesizers, and winding melodies accentuate the stellar composition on show here. What's most impressive about this balls to the wall production and composition style is how often it completely sticks to landing. There's only the occasional misstep. What's most telling about Need Disease is how unashamedly well produced it is. It's clear that Mr. Kenowski had a clear vision for how the album should sound, although I'd argue for all its instrumental overdubs and branching harmonies, the album would be almost as good if it were just Mr. Kenowski and his vocals. The chord changes and playful back and forth between tonal shifts and chromatic riffing found on Trustworthy tell the listener that just 2 tracks in you're in for something special. It's not afraid to be playful either, which might be a little surprising considering that on paper Mr. Kenowski is at his core a folk musician, a moniker which doesn't usually pair well with lush production and playful ideas, at least in my experience of listening to a Bob Dylan album once. There's a virtuosic element to Mr. Kenowski's guitar playing on display here that provides a solid counterpoint to the less conventional vocal direction. The man can shred, that's for sure. What's a massive point in the win column for Mr. Kenowski is there's the occasional glimmer that he could be going harder than he did in certain instances, but it's the restraint on display that does more for me than how fast or complicated the arpeggios and chord shapes are. It never feels like the guitar work is doing any less than it should, but what's really remarkable is there's not a single point where it feels like it could be doing any more. Every composition, especially from the guitar point of view, feels balanced and right where it should be. There's elements of the production that become a little overwhelming in places, and the euphoria shifts into some kind of auditory onslaught. In particular, Darkwood Dangers goes maybe a little too hard on the synths and modulation, and Supine Overtones feels like it's the only song where overproduction may be an issue, particularly with sound effects. Saying that, I listened on my studio monitors and headphones. I imagine something like this would sound absolutely magic if it were mixed for surround sound. Sometimes the low end is a little on the muddy side, but it's usually disguised by with what's happening in the mid and upper range, and vice versa, sometimes the highs can be a little shrill. I don't think it's masterfully mixed or mastered, but it's certainly incredibly competent in my humble opinion. The audio onslaught gives way to Sucrose Overdose, which hits the right balance without going too hard or too soft. It's almost euphoric. I keep coming back to that word, euphoric. I thought for a while about the best way to describe the music on Need Disease, but I just keep coming back to a feeling of euphoria. The way the production gives way to an acoustic refrain with just the right amount of reverb and playful use of panning and EQ trickery right when you're beginning to feel overwhelmed is almost masterful in places, and it happens absolutely everywhere on Need Disease. Mr. Kenowski is clearly a master when it comes to the dynamic ebb and flow that makes these kind of releases work. There's the occasional overuse of sampling and such that I feel is a bit superfluous, but given Mr. Kenowski has hit nearly every other button on target here, a bit of leeway is to be expected. It's not something I've ever been particularly fond of. I feel that artists should be able to carry mood and tonal intention without shoehorning in samples. It's definitely a preference though. Vocally, the range displayed by Mr. Kenowski is both impressive and a little overwhelming. Variety is the aim of the game here, which creates this weird dissonance between tracks where sonically you're not quite sure you're listening to the same singer throughout. If Mr. Kenowski didn't put his Kenowski on the front and instead used an artist name, I'd honestly have thought there was maybe 2 artists on this project. I'm sure this is intentional of course, but my preference on albums like this is to connect with the singer using a consistent tonal quality. And yet Mr. Kenowski manages to tread the line so finely that again, it just works. The album hits its emotional peak and arguable high point with Avalanche, which takes a slight step back in terms of production and guitar work to let the user enjoy the space between the notes, while making probably the best use of sampling on the album. The way Avalanche builds and engulfs the listener like some kind of snowy landslide before giving way to the album's most tender lyrics is commendable in how emotionally raw it is. Avalanche is the one song on the album that I think could benefit from a release in a more stripped back form, even if just for listener curiosity. It also takes the impressive achievement of showing the best use of vocal overdubbing and harmonic resonance, which given the quality on display here is really saying something. So Kyle John Kenowski's Need Disease is the album worth a listen to? Absolutely yes, at least once. Your mileage may vary as it's incredibly dense from a production point of view to the point where the nuance might be lost without proper context. I don't think it's an album that can be listened to on small speakers or earbuds, it really needs to have your full attention. It's a stellar headphone album, an okay speaker album, and would be phenomenal in surround sound if that were an option. So, resounding yes, you should probably listen to this.